All right, students. This set of notes, we're going to learn about cells, particularly this thing called cell theory. And cells, as we learned, are the basic building blocks of life. They are the very smallest level that life can be. Before we keep going, um, just a couple of random facts. The average human being is composed of around 100 um, trillion cells, or 1 trillion, depending on the number, and that's trillion with a T. So there is a lot of cells that make up the average human being. Some are going to have more depending on your age. So if you're younger and smaller, you'll have more. Once you get to adulthood, you'll have more cells composed inside of you. And whenever you take a look at on a piece of paper where you see a little dot I, it would take at least 50 cells to cover the area that makes up the dot on that little I. So these cells really are the basic. They are the very tiniest pieces. But when you put them together, you make things like tissue. Those tissues make your organs, like your hearts, stomachs, brains, and so on. They make the organ systems, which then make up you as an organism. So as we go through here, we're going to learn a little bit about the history of cells. You need to paraphrase. If you're asking if I need to write all this stuff down, you did not listen to this set of instructions on your notes. So make sure you are paraphrasing as we go through these for your sections. So let's start with the discovery of cells, and it came from this guy by the name of Robert Hooke. In 1665, he was an English scientist, as you can tell by his sweet ancient hairstyle. Robert Hooke discovered cells while looking at a thin slice of cork using a microscope, a very primitive one in the background. He named these after the little rooms that these monks who lived in Christian monasteries at the time that were very basic, provided all that the monks would need to stay in. Sorry about that. He thought that cells only existed in plant and fungi because cork, it comes from a tree. It comes from a plant. So we originally thought cells just came from plants and fungi. Now we move on to our next scientist. This guy's name is Anton van Leeuwenhoek. A couple years later, in 1673, Anton used a handmade microscope to observe pond scum, which is just like pond water. He saw small single-celled organisms moving around the water. He called them animalcules, which is kind of like molecules, but with animals. He observed blood cells from fish, birds, frogs, and humans. So he first saw that these living things were made of cells. Therefore, he changed the idea that cells were only in plant and fungi, but now that they were also found in animals. So we're building our list of living things that we've discovered. Now, I apologize for some of the pictures. These are kind of gross. So for almost 200 years after Hooke discovered cells, we didn't know a whole lot else about them. We actually believed that there's this thing called spontaneous generation, where animals, plants, cells were just produced out of certain things, like mice would come out of rotting grain, flies and maggots would come out of rotting meat. We didn't know that these things were just coming out of these places because those were great homes for these animals in their early lifestyles. So we just thought life kind of created itself in certain situations, not that it had to come from anything else. Now, this guy by the name of Louis Pasteur came around in the 1800s, and Pasteur doubted that spontaneous generation was this thing. He was like, let's actually see if this is a real thing or not. So he conducted a couple of experiments, one where he just sealed off meat. So it was like in a jar, it was sealed off from the rest of the world. And then he left a piece of meat out. And he found out that, yes, when you leave meat out to the open world, flies discover on it. But when you seal it off, nothing seems to generate from it. And through a few other experiments, he basically found out that life comes from other life. Humans make other humans, dogs make other dogs, trees make other trees, bacteria make other bacteria, and so on. So this gets us to that point of cells, that where is all of this life originating from for each living thing? Then came these guys named Schleiden and Schwann. Matthias Schleiden concluded that plants are made up of these things called cells. Basically, by looking inside of them, he looked at multiple samples. He realized that every single plant had to be made of cells, just like what we discovered in parts of life. Theodor Schwann came around and concluded that all animals are also made of cells, just in different shapes and forms, but they still have some of the basic parts and so forth. You can kind of see the dots on the inside of each of them. Every single cell has one of those. Our final cell theory comes from this guy named Rudolf Virchow. In 1858, he looked at experiments of Louis Pasteur, which proved that cells didn't come out of nowhere. And he came up with this very important concept, which is one of the first parts of cell theory. On his own experiments, he concluded that cells have to come from other cells. So as you see down here, we have one cell that then splits into two cells and they keep going. And then those two cells would split again and keep splitting. And that's how life kind of kept itself going from these single cells, or how cells grow inside of everything else too. Now, here's how cell theory works. There's three components that everything that has cells and how cells work, just follow these things. First, all organisms are composed of one or more cells. That was one of our properties of life. 2, the cell is the basic unit of life, which means that if we're composed of them, that's our basic piece. And number 3 is the important one. All cells have to come from an existing cell. When a tree lets the seeds go for other plants, the tree forms those cells within itself and splits off and lets it go. If you look at certain species of starfish, if one of the limbs is detached, the starfish will actually grow from each set of limbs, making 2 separate starfish. Same thing with a few types of worms. As they get cut up, a new worm forms from those pieces. It's the same thing with our cells. So just a couple of quick main ideas. We discovered it first by just being curious and looking at things under a microscope and seeing what we found. And then cell theory. Again, all organisms are composed of one or more cells. Cells are the basic unit of life, and all cells come from existing cells. And that wraps up our piece. Depending on how your teacher is feeling, we will probably show you the cringy wrap at the end of class. Enjoy, and nice job finishing